Jake Morrison walked through the bright halls of Andromeda Academy Station, his backpack heavy with books and papers. Around him, students from 12 different worlds moved in perfect harmony. The tall blue Zephyrians glided past with their flowing robes, while the crystal-like luminoids sparkled as they walked. Jake could hear them all talking in their native languages, but thanks to the translation implants in their heads, everyone understood each other perfectly. Jake was different from all the other students. He was human, and humans did not use translation implants. His people learned languages the old way, by studying and practicing. Most alien species thought this was primitive and slow. They had been using neural implants for over 300 years. The tiny devices in their brains could translate any language instantly. It made communication across the galaxy simple and easy. The young human had spent 2 years learning the common galactic language before coming to the academy. His pronunciation was still rough, and he often had to think carefully about grammar. Rules. Other students sometimes smiled when he made mistakes. They could switch between dozens of languages without any effort, while Jake struggled with just one extra language beyond his native English. Professor Cathara, a tall green plantoid, was leading today's advanced engineering class. 24 students from 8 different species sat in the curved classroom. The project was important. They had to design a new type of space station that could support multiple alien environments. Each team had members from different worlds, and they needed to work together to solve complex problems. Jake sat with his team partners. Zix, a small purple creature with 6 arms from the hexapod world; Lumtar, a glowing being made of living light; and Velanina, a rock-like student whose body contained precious metals. Thanks to their implants, they could all understand each other when they spoke. Jake had to rely on his studied knowledge of galactic common tongue. The class was going well. Students shared ideas freely, mixing languages and thoughts through their neural connections. Some spoke in musical tones, others in color patterns, and a few used scent signals. The translation implants handled everything smoothly. Jake took careful notes, working hard to keep up with the fast conversation. Suddenly, the Academy's alarm system began to sound. A calm voice spoke through the speakers in perfect galactic common. "Attention all students and staff. Solar storm activity has been detected from the nearby star. All electronic systems will be temporarily affected. Please remain calm and follow emergency procedures." Jake looked up from his notes as a strange feeling filled the room. The other students had stopped talking. They were looking at each other with confusion on their faces. Zix made a series of clicking sounds that Jake had never heard before. Lumtar began flashing different colors rapidly. Velanina started making low rumbling noises. "What is everyone saying?" Jake asked in galactic common. But his teammates just looked at him with blank expressions. They seemed to understand that he was talking, but they could not figure out what his words meant. For the first time since coming to the Academy, Jake realized that none of them actually knew the galactic common language. They had always relied completely on their implants to translate everything. The electromagnetic pulse from the solar storm had disabled every translation device on the station. Without their neural implants working, the students could only speak and understand their own native languages. The classroom quickly filled with chaos as species tried to communicate with each other using their natural sounds, lights, and movements. The aquatic students began making high-pitched whale-like calls. The insectoid species clicked and buzzed loudly. The gas-form beings created swirling patterns in the air that meant nothing to the solid students. Fear and confusion spread through the room as everyone realized they were completely cut off from each other. Professor Cathara tried to maintain order, but she could only communicate with the 2 other plantoid students in the class. Her flowing, leafy movements and color changes meant nothing to the other species. Students began grouping together with others from their own worlds, leaving members of single-species minorities completely isolated. Jake watched the breakdown with growing amazement. He had always felt like the primitive student who could not keep up with advanced galactic technology. Now he realized something incredible. While every other student in the Academy was completely helpless without their implants, he could still understand and speak the common language that everyone was supposed to know. He stood up and spoke clearly in Galactic Common. Everyone please stay calm. The solar storm will pass soon. A few students turned to look at him, but most were too panicked to notice. The Zephyrians were releasing stress pheromones that made the air smell terrible. The crystalline beings were flashing so brightly that other students had to cover their eyes. The noise level in the room was becoming unbearable. Jake realized that his human disadvantage had suddenly become the most valuable skill on the entire station. While advanced alien civilizations had become completely dependent on technology for communication, humans had maintained their natural ability to learn and use multiple languages. For the first time in his life, Jake Morrison was the most capable communicator in a room full of brilliant alien minds, the Academy's greatest minds, students who could solve complex mathematical equations and design incredible technologies. Were now as helpless as babies when it came to basic communication. Only the primitive human could bridge the gap between species. Jake looked around the chaotic classroom and knew that everything was about to change. Jake Morrison stood in the middle of the chaotic classroom, watching his fellow students struggle to communicate. The noise was getting worse every minute. Crystalline beings flashed angry red lights while gaseous students formed confused spiral patterns in the air. The translation implants remained dead, killed by the electromagnetic pulse from the solar storm. Professor Cathara had given up trying to teach and was now attempting to contact the Academy administration. But even she could only reach other Plantoid staff members. The entire education system had ground to a halt because nobody could talk to anyone from a different world. Jake pulled out his simple tablet and stylus, while other students carried advanced holographic devices that responded to thought patterns. Jake used an old-fashioned writing pad that his human professors had given him. He had always felt embarrassed about his primitive technology, but now it was the only device in the room that still worked after the electromagnetic storm. Near the front of the class, 3 mantis-like Thrick students were making frantic gestures at 2 gaseous beings. The Thricks were trying to explain something about their engineering project, but their clicking mandible sounds meant nothing to the gas forms. The floating students could only respond with swirling cloud patterns that looked like frustration. Jake walked over to the struggling group. He had been working on the same engineering problem for weeks, and knew exactly what the Thrick students were trying to communicate. They needed to explain a mathematical formula for calculating pressure differentials in mixed atmosphere environments. Without saying a word, Jake began drawing on his tablet. He started with simple numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Mathematics was universal. Every intelligent species understood basic counting and arithmetic. The Thricks and gaseous students stopped their frantic gesturing and watched Jake's stylus move across the screen. Next, Jake drew a circle and wrote the symbol for pi. Then he sketched a triangle and marked its angles. The students gathered closer, their confusion changing to interest. Numbers and geometric shapes meant the same thing to every species in the galaxy, regardless of what language they spoke or what planet they came from. Jake continued drawing. He sketched a simple container and drew arrows showing pressure pushing against its walls. He added numbers to show force calculations and drew more arrows to indicate direction and movement. Within minutes, he had created a visual explanation of the complex engineering concept that the Thricks had been trying to describe. The gaseous students began swirling in excited patterns, clearly understanding the mathematical relationships Jake had drawn. One of them floated over to the tablet and somehow managed to manipulate the display, adding their own symbols to show how gas pressure would behave in the system Jake had sketched. Other students in the classroom began to notice what was happening. A group of aquatic beings swam closer in their mobility tanks. Rockoid students rolled over on their heavy mineral legs. Even the nervous Zephyrians stopped releasing stress pheromones and approached Jake's tablet, encouraged by his success. Jake began expanding his drawings. He sketched a simple face with an upward curve for happiness and a downward curve for sadness. The emotional expressions were immediately recognizable to every student, regardless of their physical form. A crystalline being flashed a pleased blue color and created the same curved pattern in its light display. Jake drew a droplet shape and pointed to the aquatic students. They understood immediately and began making approving bubble sounds. He sketched flames and pointed to the Pyroid students, who glowed brighter with excitement. For the rock-like students, he drew geometric crystal patterns that represented their mineral-based existence. Word spread quickly through the classroom. Students who had been huddled in species-specific groups began gathering around Jake and his tablet. They watched in amazement as the human used simple pictures to communicate ideas that had seemed impossible to share without translation technology. Jake realized he was onto something much bigger than just solving one classroom problem. He began drawing more complex concepts. He sketched a light bulb to represent ideas and knowledge. He drew question marks to show curiosity and confusion. He created arrows pointing in different directions to indicate movement, change, and cause and effect. Relationships. The students started contributing to his visual system. A hexapod drew a six-sided pattern that represented their species' way of thinking about problems from multiple angles. An energy being created a wave pattern that showed their understanding of frequency and vibration. Each species added their own insights to Jake's growing pictogram language. Professor Cathara approached the group, her leaf patterns showing curiosity and amazement. Even though she could not understand what the students were saying in their native languages, she could clearly see that they were communicating successfully through Jake's drawings. Jake drew a teacher figure at a board, with student figures sitting and paying attention. He pointed to the professor and then to all the students around him. The meaning was clear. They wanted to continue learning. Even without their translation implants, the professor's color patterns shifted to show understanding and approval. She gestured for Jake to continue his visual communication system. Other students throughout the academy had heard about what was happening in the engineering classroom. They began arriving to see the human who could somehow talk to everyone without using any technology. Jake found himself at the center of something revolutionary. His simple drawings were creating connections between alien minds that had never truly communicated before. The translation implants had always converted one language into another, but Jake's pictures were creating genuine understanding by appealing to the mathematical and logical concepts that formed the foundation of all intelligent thought. As more students gathered around his tablet, Jake realized that humanity's greatest weakness had become the galaxy's most powerful tool for communication. The species that had been considered too primitive for advanced translation technology had discovered something far more valuable, a way to share ideas that transcended the boundaries between different forms of life entirely. Professor Zentar arrived at the engineering classroom just as Jake was finishing his explanation of orbital mechanics using nothing but simple drawings. The elderly ethereal being floated through the doorway, his translucent form shimmering with curiosity. He had heard reports from across the academy about a human student who was somehow communicating with every species without translation technology. Jake looked up from his tablet as the famous professor approached. Professor Zentar was known throughout the galaxy as one of the wisest educators alive. His people, the ethereals, were pure energy beings who had existed for millions of years. They had invented many of the translation systems used by younger species. The professor gestured for Jake to continue his demonstration. Even without words, his meaning was clear through his movements and the gentle glow patterns he created. Jake drew a new picture on his tablet, a light bulb symbol with lines radiating outward to represent the spreading of knowledge and ideas. Professor Zentaris' energy form brightened with understanding and approval. He began communicating with Jake through a combination of light patterns and simple gestures, encouraging the human to expand his pictogram system. The professor could see that something extraordinary was happening in his academy. Over the next several hours, Jake worked with students from every species to develop a comprehensive visual communication system. Each alien race contributed their understanding of universal concepts that appeared in every intelligent culture across the galaxy. The aquatic students helped Jake understand how to represent flow and movement through curved lines and wave patterns. They showed him that water symbols could represent not just liquid, but also the concept of life itself. Since every known species needed some form of liquid to survive, the crystalline beings taught Jake about symmetry and mathematical beauty. They helped him design geometric patterns that could represent complex scientific concepts. A hexagon could mean structure and strength. A spiral could represent growth and development. A perfect circle could show completeness and unity. The insectoid species contributed their knowledge of efficient organization. They showed Jake how to create symbols for cooperation, teamwork, and community building. Their natural hive mind thinking helped him design pictograms that could represent group activities and shared decision-making. Jake spent days working with each species, learning how their minds approached different concepts. He discovered that, while languages varied tremendously across the galaxy, certain ideas appeared in every intelligent culture. Every species understood the difference between safety and danger, between known and unknown, between individual and group. The human began organizing these universal concepts into categories. Basic needs included food, water, shelter, and safety. Emotions that translated across species barriers included contentment, distress, curiosity, and fear. Actions that every species could recognize included movement, rest, learning, and teaching. Most importantly, Jake developed symbols for learning itself. He created pictograms for books and knowledge storage, for questions and answers, for teaching and understanding. These symbols became the foundation of his communication system because they allowed species to discuss the process of education and knowledge sharing. Jake's tablet screen filled with hundreds of simple drawings, each representing a concept that any intelligent being could understand. He organized them into logical groups and created combination rules that allowed for more complex communication. Two symbols placed together could create new meanings. Arrows could show relationships between ideas, word of Jake's pictogram system. Spread throughout Andromeda Academy, students from distant parts of the station traveled to see the human who had solved the communication crisis. Professors from multiple species began studying his visual language. Amazed by its simplicity and effectiveness, Dr. Velsara, the Academy's leading expert on xenolinguistics, examined Jake's work with growing excitement. She was a tentacled being, whose species had spent centuries studying how different alien languages developed. Through Jake's pictogram system, she was able to communicate with him for the first time without translation technology. She helped Jake understand that his visual system was more than just a replacement for broken implants. The pictograms were actually creating better communication than the advanced translation technology had ever achieved. When species used implants, they were still thinking in their native languages and having those thoughts converted into other languages. This process always carried the risk of misunderstanding and cultural bias. Jake's pictograms were different because they bypassed language entirely. Instead of converting one set of words into another set of words, the visual system made beings think about the pure concepts behind their ideas. This forced clearer thinking and more precise communication, the engineering projects that had been impossible to complete during the translation. Breakdown suddenly became easy when teams used Jake's visual system. Students found they could share complex technical concepts more accurately through pictures than they had ever managed through translated speech. Other professors began arriving from across the galaxy to study what was happening at Andromeda Academy. The news that a primitive human had developed a superior communication system sent shockwaves through advanced alien civilizations. Species that had dismissed Earth as intellectually inferior were now sending their best scholars to learn from Jake Morrison. The Academy's administration officially recognized Jake's pictogram system as a breakthrough in interspecies communication. They provided him with advanced holographic displays and computing resources to help develop his visual language further. Jake worked with teams of linguists, mathematicians, and cognitive scientists to refine and expand his symbol system. Within weeks, Jake had created the most comprehensive universal communication tool in galactic history. His simple drawings had evolved into a sophisticated symbolic language that enhanced learning for every known intelligent species. The human who had once felt primitive and backward was now leading the most important educational revolution in millions of years. 3 weeks after the solar storm, the translation implants at Andromeda Academy were working perfectly again. The electromagnetic pulse effects had worn off, and students could once again communicate through their neural devices. But something unexpected was happening in classrooms across the station. Many students were choosing not to activate their implants. Jake Morrison walked into his advanced physics class to find Professor Quintal, a brilliant cephalopod educator, drawing diagrams on the holographic board using Jake's pictogram system. The 8-armed teacher had been one of the first to embrace the visual communication method, and her students were learning faster than ever before. The class included students from 9 different species, but none of them had their translation implants activated. Instead, they were communicating through the expanding pictogram language that Jake had developed. Mathematical equations flowed seamlessly with emotional expressions and logical reasoning symbols. Zara, a crystalline student whose faceted body sparkled with intelligence, approached Jake after class. Through a combination of light patterns and pictogram symbols, she shared an incredible insight. The visual communication system was not just allowing different species to understand each other, it was actually making them smarter. Jake sat down with Zara and several other students to understand what she meant. Using his tablet, he drew question marks and thinking symbols to encourage her to explain further. Zara responded by creating a complex light display while simultaneously drawing on her own device. She showed Jake that when beings communicated through translation implants, they were still trapped within the thinking patterns of their native languages. Each species had developed language structures that reflected their physical nature and cultural evolution. These linguistic patterns could actually limit how they approached new ideas and problems. Jake's pictogram system was different because it forced every species to think in pure concepts rather than in the words and grammar structures of their native tongues. This created a kind of mental freedom that allowed for more creative and flexible thinking. The realization spread quickly through the academy. Students began reporting that they could grasp mathematical relationships more easily when they visualized them through pictograms rather than trying to understand them through translated verbal explanations. Scientific concepts that had been difficult to learn through language became clear when represented visually. Dr. Hamara, the Academy's senior cognitive scientist, began conducting formal studies of Jake's pictogram system. Her research team included experts from 12 different species, all working together using visual communication. The results were remarkable. Students using pictograms scored significantly higher on comprehension tests than those using traditional translation methods. The improvement was not just in communication between different species. Individual students found that thinking in pictograms enhanced their problem-solving abilities even when working alone. The visual system seemed to engage different parts of their brains, leading to more creative and insightful solutions. News of the teaching revolution reached the highest levels of Galactic Education Administration. Chancellor Dexa Moore, the Supreme Director of Interspecies Learning, arrived at Andromeda Academy with a delegation of education ministers from 47 different worlds. They came expecting to find a minor communication improvement, but instead discovered a complete transformation of how intelligent beings could learn and think. Jake found himself invited to present his pictogram system to the most powerful educators in the galaxy. Standing before beings whose civilizations had existed for millions of years, the young human felt nervous but determined. He had prepared his presentation entirely in visual symbols, knowing that this would demonstrate the power of his system better than any verbal explanation, using massive holographic displays. Jake showed how pictograms could represent everything from basic emotions to complex scientific theories. He demonstrated how different symbols could be combined to create new meanings, and how the visual system could adapt to represent concepts that had never been communicated between species before. The education ministers were amazed by what they saw. Species that had never been able to share certain types of knowledge found they could communicate complex, philosophical and scientific ideas through Jake's visual language. The pictogram system was breaking down barriers that had existed for thousands of years. Chancellor Dexamer approached Jake after the presentation. The ancient leader was a metamorphic being who could change his physical form at will, and his species was known for their wisdom and long-term thinking. Through pictograms, he told Jake that the human had created something that would change the future of intelligence itself within days. Universities and research institutions across the galaxy began implementing Jake's pictogram system. Teachers found that students from different species could work together more effectively than ever before. Research teams discovered that visual communication led to breakthrough, insights that had been impossible when scientists were limited by the thinking patterns embedded in their native languages. The system grew and evolved as more species contributed their insights. Each alien race added new symbols and concepts, making the pictogram language richer and more powerful. Jake worked with teams of linguists and cognitive scientists to organize and standardize the rapidly expanding visual vocabulary. Earth, which had been considered a primitive backwater planet, suddenly became the center of attention for the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Delegations of alien scholars traveled to human worlds to study how the species without translation technology had developed such sophisticated natural communication abilities. Jake received messages from universities across human space inviting him to return to Earth as a hero, but he chose to remain at Andromeda Academy, working with Professor Zentar and other brilliant minds to continue developing the pictogram system. He knew that his work was just beginning and that the visual communication revolution would eventually transform how every intelligent species in the galaxy learned and thought. The human who had once felt embarrassed about his primitive technology had become the most influential educator in galactic history, proving that sometimes the greatest advances come from the most unexpected sources. 6 months after the solar storm that changed everything, Jake Morrison stood before the largest gathering of intelligent beings in galactic history. The Great Assembly Hall on the capital world of Nexus Prime contained representatives from over 800 different species, all gathered to witness the formal adoption of the universal pictogram system as the official communication method for interspecies education. The massive crystalline dome stretched high above the crowd, its transparent walls showing the swirling colors of the planet's aurora. Delegates floated, crawled, swam, and walked to their designated areas, their diverse forms creating a spectacular display of life's infinite variety. Energy beings danced through the air while rock-based species positioned themselves on reinforced platforms designed to support their massive weight. Jake felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. Just months ago, he had been struggling to keep up with his classmates at Andromeda Academy, embarrassed by his primitive human technology and slow language learning. Now he was about to address the most important gathering in galactic civilization. Chancellor Dexamer introduced Jake using the pictogram system projected on enormous holographic displays throughout the assembly hall. The ancient metamorphic leader drew symbols representing discovery, wisdom, and transformation. Every being in the audience understood perfectly as he explained how a young human had revolutionized communication across the galaxy. Jake approached the central presentation platform, carrying only his simple tablet and stylus. Advanced alien technologies surrounded him, holographic projectors that could create three-dimensional images from pure thought, quantum computers that could process information faster than light itself, and translation matrices that had served galactic civilization for millennia. Yet Jake's primitive human tools had proven more powerful than all of them combined. He began his presentation with the same simple drawing that had started everything. Numbers from 1 to 10. The massive displays showed his stylus movements to every delegate in the hall. Then he drew a circle, a triangle, and a square. These basic mathematical concepts needed no translation because they represented universal truths that every intelligent species understood. Jake continued building complexity through his visual language. He showed how emotions could be represented through simple curved lines, upward curves for positive feelings, downward curves for negative ones, wavy lines for confusion or uncertainty. He demonstrated how arrows could show relationships, cause and effect, and the flow of ideas from one mind to another. The audience watched in fascination as Jake explained the principles behind the pictogram system. Unlike translation technology, which converted thoughts from one language into another while preserving the original thinking patterns, visual communication bypassed language entirely. This forced beings to focus on pure concepts, rather than the cultural assumptions built into their native tongues. Jake drew symbols, representing different species, flowing water for aquatic beings, geometric crystals for mineral-based life, spiral patterns for energy entities. Then he showed how these diverse forms of intelligence could connect through shared, mathematical and logical concepts that transcended physical differences. The presentation reached its climax when Jake demonstrated collaborative learning through pictograms. He invited volunteers from 5 different species to join him on the platform. Together, they solved a complex engineering problem using only visual symbols, their different perspectives combining to create insights that none of them could have achieved alone. The audience erupted in approval through their various forms of expression. Crystalline beings flashed brilliant colors, gaseous species swirled in excited patterns, and musical races created harmonious tones that resonated throughout the hall. The message was clear: Jake's pictogram system had created something unprecedented in galactic history. Following the presentation, the Galactic Education Council announced Jake's appointment as the first human director of interspecies communication. The position had been created specifically for him, recognizing that his contribution to galactic civilization deserved the highest possible honor. At age 23, Jake Morrison became one of the youngest beings ever to hold such an important role. The appointment sent shockwaves through civilizations that had dismissed humans as intellectually inferior. Earth, previously ignored by most galactic powers, suddenly found itself flooded with alien visitors seeking to understand the species that had unlocked universal communication. Human universities received funding offers from advanced alien governments. Wanting to establish research partnerships, Jake used his new position to establish the Institute for Visual Communication on Earth itself. The facility became a pilgrimage destination for educators from across the galaxy, all seeking to learn how humans had developed such sophisticated, natural communication abilities while rejecting technological enhancement. The Institute's research revealed something remarkable about human cognitive development. Unlike most alien species, humans had evolved as highly social creatures who needed to communicate with many different groups across varied environments. This evolutionary pressure had created exceptional natural language learning abilities and flexible thinking patterns. While other species had enhanced their communication through technology, humans had continued developing their natural abilities. This meant that when technological solutions failed, humans possessed cognitive skills that had been lost by more advanced civilizations. Jake's pictogram breakthrough was not just individual genius. It represented the collective wisdom of human evolutionary development. The universal pictogram system continued growing and evolving as more species contributed their insights. Within 2 years, it had become the primary communication method for interspecies research, diplomacy, and education. Scientific breakthroughs accelerated as researchers from different worlds could share ideas more effectively than ever before. Jake established pictogram learning centers throughout human space, training other humans to become communication specialists and ambassadors. Earth's population of natural linguists became some of the galaxy's most valuable citizens, serving as bridges between alien civilizations that had previously been unable to work together effectively. The final validation of Jake's achievement came when the ancient precursor artifacts were discovered on a distant world. These relics from a vanished civilization contained symbols that matched many elements of Jake's pictogram system. The galaxy's oldest known intelligence had apparently developed similar visual communication methods millions of years ago. Jake Morrison had not just solved a communication crisis at one academy. He had rediscovered principles of universal understanding that represented the highest achievement of intelligent thought. The human species, once considered primitive and backward, had given the galaxy its greatest gift, the ability for any form of consciousness to share ideas with any other, regardless of biology, culture, or technology, standing in his office overlooking Earth's blue oceans. Jake reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. The Pictogram system now connected minds across thousands of worlds, enabling collaboration and understanding on a scale never before imagined in galactic history. Humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to communicate and cooperate, and now that strength belonged to the entire galaxy.